Welcome back, everybody. My guest this week is General Sir Richard Barrons. Richard had an amazing army career, commanding at every rank from captain to full general, and finished his army career as commander of Joint Forces Command, one of the 6 chiefs of staff leading the UK Armed Forces between 2013 and 2016. In that role, he was responsible for about 23,000 people worldwide and had a budget of around £4.3 billion. His military career covers the last decade of the Cold War and all the way through military operations in Bosnia, Kosovo, Northern Ireland, Iraq and Afghanistan. So an amazing operational pedigree without any doubt. These days, he has a global role with CAE, working on government relations and strategy, and he's the co-chairman of Universal Defence and Security Solutions. He's a regular commentator on radio and TV, particularly speaking about senior leadership, defence and security issues, not least in the face of recent conflicts. Richard's also a personal friend. I worked for him very closely in my last 3 tours, because when I was the Chief of Defence Staff's liaison officer in Washington and subsequently the Assistant Chief of Defence Staff Operations, and in my final role as Director Joint Warfare, in each of those roles, I was working directly for him. And it was a real privilege to do so, because he's a great leader, a really, really super chap to work for, with an amazing sense of humour and just a fantastic portfolio of skills that are so appropriate to what I'm trying to do with this podcast. So I think this should be a really great session that you're going to enjoy, and hopefully you'll get lots of snippets from it. I certainly enjoyed recording it with him. And without further ado, I'm Bob Judson. This is Leading for Life Stories, and I really, really hope you enjoy what comes next. Richard, great to have you on the podcast. Thank you very much indeed for agreeing to join. We've had a pretty long relationship, and I'm really pleased to have you. I think it'll be a lot of fun.
Oh, I'm delighted to be here.
Thank you. Just for the starters, because obviously I know you very well, but a lot of my listeners don't. So you've had an amazing military career. You've successfully transitioned now into the private sector. And just to get us started, can you give a kind of resume of your career to date, as it were, right back from the start of it?
Certainly. So I joined the Army at 18 in 1977. Just before I went to Oxford University to read philosophy, politics and economics. So I went through university as a very, very junior Army officer. I joined the Royal Regiment of Artillery. I'm a gunner. I've been a gunner there for 45 years at least now. And the first 10 years of my military career were as essentially an artillery officer, and that was the Cold War. So a lot of time spent in Germany, mostly in a place called Hona, which is co-located with the Bergen-Belsen concentration camp. So by any standards, it's not the most glamorous place in Europe. And then I went to Staff College, and that provided a bit of a watershed into what became the Balkan decade, where I had the good fortune of being the Chief of Staff of the initial foray into Bosnia at about a week's notice in October 1992. And there were subsequent tours in Bosnia and then into Kosovo, at which time I was commanding my regiment, 3rd Regiment Royal Horse Artillery. And the Balkan decade and a half closed. I recall we were sent for strictly 3 months, and the thing came down after about 14 years. And then after that, it was the Iraq-Afghanistan, a decade stretching, in the case of Afghanistan, into 20 years. So my first deployment into Afghanistan at Christmas 2001 as a colonel, where I was the Chief of Staff of the headquarters that set up the original International Security Assistance Force. And my last tour in Afghanistan was as a Major General, where I set up the reintegration effort, trying to draw young Taliban out of the fight and back into Afghan civil society. My first tour in Iraq, again as a colonel, was setting up the multinational division in Basra in July 2003. And my last tour in Iraq was as a Major General, as the Deputy Commanding General in the American-led Corps headquarters, my job being to run the relationship between the American military and the Iraqi military during the course of the famous surge. And I was the Army Assistant Chief of the General Staff during the horror of the 2010 Defence Review. I then was the MOD Operations Director for 2 years during the extraction from Afghanistan from combat operations and the bombing campaign in Libya. And I concluded my time in uniform as a 4-star general as Commander Joint Forces Command, where I led the bits that glue together an Army, Navy, and Air Force, and led the agenda to transform the military to be fit for purpose in the digital age through the application of combinations of digital age technology, something that I do even to this day.
No, it's fantastic. Thanks very much. What about since you left the army then? Just give a bit of a resume of what you've done with your time.
So I've been in the afterlife since the latter stages of 2016, and I have assembled a portfolio, which sounds more methodical than it really is. A portfolio seems to me to be a bundle of accidents, and it's constantly changing, and you do some things you like and some things you have to. I have had some part-time employed work, but mostly I work in defense and security. And I set up, with a number of others, Universal Defense and Security Solutions about 5 years ago, which is one of the larger collections of former Army, Navy, Air Force, and defense civilian official. And we provide a whole range of advice and services, but we don't do any shooting. We're most certainly not the British equivalent of the Wagner Group. And around all that, I do quite a lot of media and some think tank stuff in order to fill a week with something useful.
Yeah, I've seen you a fair bit on Sky News and heard you on Radio 4 as on the broadcasting front. I think it's great that you've got such strong, such good perspectives, I suppose, on all of this, because getting sane military voices into some of what's obviously been quite a challenging political debate a lot of the time is great. So. No, I think that's terrific. You're still there, and it's obviously the latter part of your career where we might work most closely together. When you were the ops director, and I was out in Washington as the CDSLO and for Libya, and then back working for you directly for a couple of tours, and sort of following you around in the as I jumped ship slightly before you did, which was lovely. When you go right back to the beginning of all of that, what was it that kind of motivated you to join the army in the first place, and how did you prepare yourself for that? What did you do to get focused around army life?
Well, you're inferring some sort of method or plan, and I think the basic truth is, as a youngster, I was army barmy. There were some family connections, but. I'm not from a military dynasty by any manner of means. I just seem to be fascinated with the business of armies and soldiers. That led me naturally into the cadet force at school, which I think I probably took rather too seriously, but it was a very big deal for me. And I think that caused me to question what was held to be my destiny, which was to go and be a solicitor, many solicitors in my extended family. And I began to realize that I was not probably best cut out to commit myself to sitting in an office, and the military seemed to offer a wide variety of challenging, in some aspects glamorous, but varied work. And this was the time of an army of 150,000. This was the big Cold War army, and there was a major thing to join, and to join an institution that was important in the sort of national pantheon in a way that it is less now. And I think after that, frankly, it's just an accident of events. The army sponsored me to go to university. As a result of that, I had a 5-year time bar. If I hadn't had the time bar, I would have joined my peers at the end of my time in Oxford in going to the city in order to take advantage of the financial Big Bang and all that kind of thing. But I didn't. I had to go back soldiering. And then I was carried forward by a combination of events, such as, go to Bosnia, go to Afghanistan, go to Iraq, and the opportunity to command at higher levels and to take broad responsibility. And to be honest, the army is a vocation. It's not like a job, and I saw no separation between my work and my life. And my lifelong friends are generally in the military, certainly up until fairly recently. And I basically forgot to leave. until I arrived as a 4-star general and my time was up. I'm as surprised as anybody that I lasted as long as I did.
Yeah, it's brilliant. I find myself smiling a lot while you're saying that, because the story's so similar. I mean, the cadet force, one of the reasons I ended up joining as a direct entrant, not going through university into the Air Force, was I spent way too much time in the cadets and getting so focused on doing that I kind of forgot to study hard enough for my A-levels. So I passed them, but I didn't get the grades. So it was something I have to say I've never really regretted. But and it's funny, isn't it? Because I joined, I think a lot of us did in those days, where you joined on I don't know how long it's going to last, but I'm probably joining this for a reasonably long period of time, certainly as a pilot, where the training period was long and all the rest of it. But I never expected it would take me through into my 50s and be there for a sort of full career. And I have to say it was great to do something that was just, as you say, a real vocation and was lovely to do, and with some pretty spicy moments along the way. But they're sad. I'm sure you'll have the same reflection. I mean, when I look back now, one of the things when I was transitioning out, I talked a lot to people about wanting to work for an organization at least once that was growing. Because like you, I joined an Air Force that was not as big as the Army, but was still nearly 100,000 strong. And by the time I left, it was 30,000. It was a dramatic, downshift. And the whole thing was about managing decline, which I think has been a challenge.
I sometimes think now I'm in the afterlife that staying as long as I did was conceivably an act of self-harm. If I had thought enough about wanting a subsequent commercial career, defined as if I thought I wanted to run a really big public company, then I now know you essentially need to leave earlier. You need to leave in your 40s at about the brigadier army speak or colonel level, and transition into industry in order to learn and grow the profile that a board needs to appoint you as their CEO or as a chairman. And stepping into the afterlife as a superannuated 4-star general, you're in a very thin market for reasons I now understand, but I had no conception of actually on the day that I left. On the other hand, if I had left as a brigadier, I would not have done the things that I got to do in the latter half of my career, including ending up as one of the UK Chiefs of Staff. And very few people get to do that. And I generally take the view that my military career continued to pass the dinner party test, when you sit with your peers you maybe you've known since university, and you talk about what you do or what you did. And those are my peers who have become very successful entrepreneurs or professionals. They didn't have the life that I did, and I think I won that aspect of having a rich life.
Yeah, I totally agree, and that reflects so much my own experience. I find very often when you do a kind of round of introductions at a conference or whatever, and the amount of times people have sat there and gone, God, I'm glad I didn't go after you. When you talk about all the things I did and the flying career I had and everything else. So it was a fabulous set of opportunities. But I completely share your view about, if you want a proper commercial career, then the time you leave is really important. I think it's interesting. It's a slight digression, but I think it's a relevant one. It's interesting when you look at the military today and people joining today with everything that's different. So the different level of opportunity, different scale of the organization, the sort of number of promotion opportunities, et cetera, that are there, and also a very different pension scheme, that it is going to be challenging. I think I talked recently to some senior Air Force bods about this, that there's plenty of people knocking on the door to go and join, but I think retention is going to continue to be a really, really big challenge for them. And I don't quite know how they're going to address that, because I think the pull of the commercial world and the financial challenge of public sector work, which is never going to be as remunerated as the commercial world, it can't be. That's hard, and I don't know how they square that circle, to be honest.
So I think some of this is cyclical, and the armed forces generally struggle to recruit when they're not at war. War is a great recruiting sergeant. And in circumstances where people think the armed forces are in decline, and they read all their social media and in the press about poor accommodation, lack of money for training, underfunded equipment, which is symptomatic of armed forces that have been on a path of hollowing out since the end of the Cold War, because there's been no existential peril. And everything you say about why people stay now, I think is absolutely accurate. However, this is why I think we should be both concerned and also to some degree confident. In the world we live in now, the return to great power confrontation on the tableau set by climate change, and just look at, as we sit here today, the wars in Ukraine and between Israel and Palestine. We are now not in the post-Cold War era. We can't really think of ourselves as post-conflict. We're definitely now pre-conflict in a way you can't really define. And the challenge for society and the military is that in an era of great power confrontation, which could become conflict, those conflicts could be big wars, and big wars are fought, won, and lost by civil society. And many more people would have to join the military when there's an existential risk to our security and our prosperity and our values. But that moment has not yet come. And the thing I worry about is there's a lag between the issue presenting itself that requires essentially mobilization and the nation's ability to rise to the challenge. And in that period of lag, bad things can happen. But I in many ways think there's never been a better time to join the armed forces, given the range of challenges that the United Kingdom and its allies faces. But that message, I think, has some way to go to sink into Generation Z, for example.
Yeah, no, again, completely agree. And as you say, it's a fascinating time in kind of geopolitical history as much as anything else. Oh, we could have a whole podcast on this, so I won't continue it because I think otherwise we will digress too much. As you know, obviously, I aim to talk quite a lot about leadership on these things. I'd be really interested in your reflections on leadership style across a very long army career and now moving into the world of civilian life as well, and just how you've shaped and adjusted your own style really as you've gone through the various roles to the very top of the military, literally the very top of the military, and then shifting outside.
So I think, and my guess is this is better understood with hindsight, the business of being a military leader runs through a series of stages. And the first stage is very tactical. In my case, you're focused on a group of about 30 soldiers, and you're leading them in a highly contested environment of the battlefield. But essentially, you are leading them through the execution of really well-honed skills and drills, and it's about setting an example and being professionally competent and demanding that your people follow you to do the things they've been trained to do. But the ability to execute drills well doesn't really survive contact with more senior leadership, where you are having to be more thoughtful about the options that you choose and the complexity of the problems that you have to untangle. So that's a different sort of professional competence, whether you're a commander or a senior staff officer. So I think the training that we receive, say, at Staff College is a way of changing people from being the really brilliant executors of drills to people who can think about a problem and innovate and be dynamic and adaptive rather than apply a template. Having said that, we would both recognize that particularly in something like the Cold War armed forces, the enthusiasm for sticking to a template, for doing things last week like you did in the week before and would do them in the following week, that wasn't helpful. We needed to grow out of that when the world changed and the Cold War ended. I think at the highest levels in defense, where you're part of a whole of government, all levers of power approach to a big problem, then leadership is much more about building a consensus with people who won't respond to instructions. You don't own them. You have no authority over them. You may have some convening power, but you have to bring them together, whether that's allies in a coalition or partners across government. And it's that reason that to this very day, I recoil in horror when people say to me, who really should know better, that, well, for you military people, you don't really understand leadership because you just shout a lot and people have to do what you say. Well, actually, even at the tactical level, just shouting at people does not encourage them to put their lives at risk, although, there can be a certain imperative. But at the medium to higher levels of military leadership, shouting has no part to play. In fact, it's counterproductive. You're trying to get people to understand what they must do, difficult though it is, and then and do it willingly, and not just sort of out of some sort of curiosity. That wouldn't work either well. And now in the civilian world that I inhabit, the first thing that struck me about leadership is everything I do now is transactional. I'm no longer in the vocation of the armed forces, and the commercial world is less structured, quite ruthless to that extent, quite liberating, but also chaotic. And you're working with people who, in many cases, have no sense of loyalty. I mean, loyalty is an entirely bought commodity in some settings. But where the relationship is transactional, even if it's polite and friendly, the fact is it is about constructing arrangements over the exchange of money more than anything else. I much prefer the vocational setting. And in the case of universal defense and security solutions, one of the reasons we set it up was to give people like us a home which would feel more like the vocational setting that they grew up in, even though we're applying that in a commercial transactional way. And that allows us, to be honest, to do it to others before they do it to us in a way that we don't want to be taken advantage of. And we're getting better at that. And the other thing I'd say about leadership is people want to talk about leadership, and they also need to talk about followership at every level. And I see commercial organizations, as I saw in public service, where an instruction is issued and the people at lower levels in the organization seem determined to take that as just the basis for a discussion or even an option. And if they don't like it, they elect very unhelpfully to do their own thing in their own way. And I think we should dwell a bit on how people know the duty of following as well as trying to talk about the duties of a leader.
No, again, I completely agree with that. And interestingly, one of the reasons that I got kind of into leadership development work post my time at Deloitte, post the military, was because I do think in the commercial world quite often, and I'm trying hard not to generalize here, leadership is not a strong suit of a lot of organizations because they just don't invest much time in preparing people to lead things. Whereas we've had the good fortune, I guess, over many, many years to starting from some foundational stuff right at the beginning, but also then lots of interventions along the way to give you further support, help, and tools and techniques to be able to lead people really effectively. That just isn't a priority in the business world because, as you say, a lot of the time it's an investment overhead they don't want to pay for. And so if they get training, it's all too often by luck rather than judgment, and the cream rises to the top. So you get some people who are good naturally, but there are a lot of people who also rise to the top because their business performance has been good, but actually their leadership skills are not. And again, your followership point, I totally and utterly agree with. And I think that has got more challenging with some of the younger generations. I know with the work I do with Deloitte University, for example, the senior manager level there, so the sort of 30-ish age group, from early 30s through to late 30s in the main, do find it really quite hard to work with some of the real youngsters joining from university these days because they kind of just have a different value set and they just approach stuff very differently in terms of the way they function, the way they think, the way they want to work, their willingness to come into the office post-COVID, and all those sorts of things have played a really big challenging part. So no, I could not agree more with all of that. And I think, interestingly, I've also, to your shouting point, I come across that very frequently, that people think that we live in an authoritarian leadership world in the military, and that's what works. And of course, as we both know, that's definitely not the case the majority of the time. It's a fascinating debate that I think will run and run.
I think you make a very interesting point about the challenges faced by I think we're doomed to call them Generation Z, the youngsters who are entering the workforce now, in the way that they have become accustomed to thinking about their place in the world. And I think we've reached a point where in at least British society, we've developed this idea of the perfect freedom of the individual to a quite extraordinary extent, where the youth of today, and I'm very much separated by age from that generation, that they're clear in their own minds how they want to work and what they want to do, and they have this sense of that in their mind, and they're not shy in explaining that. And the whole work from home or be a digital nomad, all of that is an aspect of it. And I think there is now going to be profound dissonance between that quite cultured ambition to lead a life of, frankly, perfect liberty and freedom to please oneself, and where something goes wrong, it's somebody else's problem to fix it, probably the government. And the world we actually live in, which is clearly becoming much more challenging and competitive and daunting, and where I think we're all going to find we're going to have to change how we live. And it can't be the case that everybody else has to make the sacrifice so that we don't. And we are absolutely going to have to recondition ourselves to stop consuming quite so much stuff now in order to sustain society and the planet for the future. And I think some of this Generation Z will swing with easily. They understand the climate emergency. But I think when it comes to them conforming to the diktats of their employer or an institution to work in a particular way, or in some cases to actually work, then I think they're going to struggle. But we are going to all end up in a place where we're going to have to manage greater risk, be more competitive in standing up for our own interests, and frankly be less comfortable. And to that extent, Generation Z may be running on the fumes of the life we actually led, but which I think is receding quickly into the past.
Yeah, it's a great debate that we could continue to run on with. I mean, that's before we start talking about the implications of AI and all that goes with that as well. Because I've been on some fascinating debates recently where, and you saw that with the Prime Minister's AI conference recently, where the extreme end of that, you've got Elon Musk saying, "Well, there won't be any jobs unless you want one. You're going to do it voluntarily. There won't be anything else." And I think that's quite a long way off, but there's certainly going to be a big reshaping of the way the world works because of things that AI can deliver, and particularly some of the jobs in research and the legal profession is a good example of that, where people have traditionally started out as looking up stuff, finding precedents, all those sorts of things, where actually now that can already be done really, really quickly. It is going to be a one to watch for sure for the next few years, and particularly for those of us that are at the in the age demographic that we are. Some challenges ahead,
and that change is going to be more difficult for us all now because we've had big industrial disturbances in the past, where there's been great displacement of what was seen as traditional and indeed eternal employment. And as AI dramatically shapes how we live, work, and play, there will be this displacement. And some of that, may be liberating. And other aspects of, I think, will be disturbing. And for people who are displaced now, well, first of all, they think as individuals, and the world is going to be populated by 8 billion individuals. They think they're all special and they matter in a way that our ancestors, in some cases, felt it was just their place in life to be put upon. And secondly, they mostly have a vote, and that makes governments reluctant to demand that they do hard things like close down their industries. And thirdly, they're all on social media, so they have a voice and a way of mobilizing based on information or disinformation that has never happened before in human history. So this displacement is going to expose, I think, many of the limitations of us as a species, Homo sapiens, to do the right thing when it's really difficult, and who knows if we'll make it.
Yeah, and absolutely. Switching tack back to you and some more personal stuff. Role models. I always like to talk about role models on this. So, who has kind of really shaped your thinking, influenced you the most across your career?
So everyone has a role model. I think when you're starting out, your role models are likely to be teachers at school, or in the case of the military, the commanders that you see most of. So they in themselves would be quite, they would be extremely good at their job. I was an artillery officer, and I was in awe of people who could employ artillery intuitively, without having to get a list out and follow it. So quite small stuff. I think rather more usefully for me in the military lane, there were two types of role model. The first were those that were just outstanding battlefield leaders. They were tremendously single-minded, extraordinarily resilient, in some cases necessarily ruthless, and almost no matter what was going on the battlefield, no matter the reverses or the weather or the shortage of ammunition or supply or the casualties, they just drove their people on, and their people understood that, and they respected it. Didn't like them ever, but they respected me for it, and they had no choice, and that made the difference on the battlefield. So people like the U.S. General Patton and the U.S. Third Army in the Second World War, I mean, there was an almost unique character who, in any other setting than a big war, would probably have been a complete menace. But that ability to keep going when it's really hard, to see through, fatigue and setbacks, that for me was an important lesson. And then I think in another dimension, there was a level of generalship at the very senior level where these people led long and difficult campaigns. They understood what war is about. War is a really complex thing, multifaceted, and they could manage the passage of a war over years and lead that interface between what the military had to do and politics and civil society. So for me, my role models would actually include Field Marshal Haig, much maligned though he is from the First World War. He led from the initial army of about 100,000 in France in 1914 to the armistice in 19, where there were 3 million under arms, and he had many shortcomings, but he never really lost his grip on the execution of a campaign. And then a bit closer in our time, Field Marshal Allenbrook, who was the chief of the Imperial General Staff, interfacing with Churchill throughout the Second World War. Again, faced with many complex problems, but he managed the armed forces through that period. And above both of those, George Marshall, who took charge of the US Army, tiny as it was on the day the Second World War started, at that point, frankly, without the US, and led throughout the Second World War, and then eventually became the Secretary of State, the Foreign Secretary. So a remarkable ability to lead military affairs at the highest level. And a couple of others I would name. One is General Giap, who led the North Vietnamese during the Vietnamese War, where they barely won a battle, but they still won the war. A remarkable feat of generalship. And in our own time, I think the most iconic military leaders were General David Petraeus, who absolutely got the link between strategy and tactics in leading the campaign in Iraq in particular, and maintaining the confidence of presidents and prime ministers as he did it. A man who was as comfortable in a foxhole as he is in the salons of the mighty, and there are not many people who can pull that off. And then Stan McChrystal, the U.S. Special Forces commander, who built the sharpest, biggest, most effective special forces machinery during the course of the war in Iraq and later, who understood that particular aspect of soldiering, and who brought a focus and a discipline and a tenacity and an innovation that you really have to have the scale of the American military machine to consider emulating.
That's a great list. I mean, as you know, I interviewed David Petraeus, so I was really privileged to do so on the podcast. And It was like a one-man leadership manual. It was amazing, actually. The insights he could come up with and the stories he had. It was absolutely fascinating to have that discussion, and a real privilege to be able to do it. That sort of segues quite neatly into the next question I wanted to ask you, which is really about, and we touched on values earlier on, but leadership traits and personal values that you think are the most important, not only for you personally, but actually the ones you look for in others, both above you and below you?
So I've thought about this a lot, and I've found that my list doesn't change very much now, looking back over 45 odd years of being a leadership practitioner. And the first thing I believe is important is integrity. And I think there are a number of constituent parts of integrity. The first of which is a commitment to the success of the enterprise and the people for whom you are responsible. And for me, that is a 7-day-a-week, 24-hour-a-day thing. You can't be the CEO or the commanding officer just Monday to Friday if something really important happens on a Saturday or a Sunday, and it's going to draw, therefore, on your stamina and your innovation and your resilience. So commitment is an important part of integrity. I think another aspect of integrity is the capacity to take hard decisions. And this can be at the expense of people that you're close to, friends in the institution that you've known for a long time who no longer fit or have, as is more often the case, behaved badly and need to go. To work out that what you do in the future has got to change. So you're going to have to stop doing what you do now in terms of equipment or organization or ways of working, and impose new things. Or the organization you're responsible for will fail. And I think a number of people struggle with taking hard, ruthless decisions because they perhaps make the mistake of making them too personal. I think a part of integrity is accountability. And I see this, I think, more in the commercial world than I saw in the military, where success very easily floats up to the senior leader who's delighted to take responsibility for it, and failure too easily cascades down to the lowest level that you can get away with. In the military is, I think, more used to the idea of accountability, that when something happens within the organization you command, just because you're the commander, you are accountable in some way for it, even if you were miles away at the time and had no hand in it. It happened, as it were, on your watch, in your name. And shying away from accountability is a poor example of integrity. And that brings me to my final part of integrity, which is personal example. So if the rules are that you behave in a certain way, you behave in that way. This idea that because you're in the C-suite or you're the general officer commanding, that these rules don't apply to you. And this could be in tiny things. If you remember in the Cold War, we had to wear our gas masks a lot. And everyone absolutely hated that. And I noticed in some settings that the wearing of the gas mask didn't really apply much above the rank of army captain. And that was mad. And we should have done better, arguably, then. And the same in the commercial world, where it's often about the approach to things like expenses or rules of conduct. Personal example, and without personal example, eventually people will question why they need to be loyal to you and listen to you, given that you're falling short.
Yeah, or they'll start following the example, of course. And I think particularly in the commercial world, that's I've seen that quite a lot. Where, well, you're doing that, why shouldn't I do that? And I think it's interesting when you look at wider society, isn't it, at the moment, that how much of it is media spin and social media amplification, disinformation, etc. But you look at the political level, for example, and all the stuff that's coming out of not least in things like the COVID inquiry. I think it's very damaging to society as a whole when people then look and start losing faith in the leadership of whatever the leadership is, whether it's a company or the military organization or or indeed at a government level, because that does start presenting some significant challenges. And I totally agree with your list. I think accountability is one that I've always personally believed is hugely important. And I used to describe it a lot as putting an umbrella up over the people that work for me. So I would very much turn around and take the view that, look, if you are honest with me and you tell me what's going on, and even if you've made an honest mistake, I will do my utmost to protect you. But I can't do that if you don't tell me what's going on and you don't give me your kind of honest feedback. But, I'll absolutely champion that. And I've got a kind of personal example from when I was commanding Coningsby and with the Battle of Britain Memorial flight, where there was a particular instance. I won't regale the whole story, but the commander of the flight was leading a formation that I was in, and we didn't deliver the job. We missed the target, and it was an honest mistake, and it caused a lot of frisson of activity in the hierarchy of the Air Force because the target was in Air Force headquarters, and I protected him completely, and had my kind of full roasting from the AOC, Air Officer Commanding at the time. And the then CEO of the BBMF has never forgotten that. He still talks about it, because effectively I took one for the team for him because I'd authorized the sortie. I was the senior supervisor. I viewed it as, very much, I'm not going to let you get hung out to dry for something that you didn't deliberately go out and do. And I think that is something that is so important, and yet often is sadly ignored by senior leaders. I mean, not least in the corporate environment. I think I've seen some pretty poor examples of behavior in the time that I've been out, as well as some of the things in the military as well.
Yeah, I think I'd add to this this list of leadership traits is the capacity for vision. So I look for leaders who've got an eye on the horizon and can detect when it's going to cause things to change, and can articulate what that change is going to be, and adapt their organization before the change smacks them in the face, even if there are big difficulties for people or equipment or investors or whatever it is. And the very best leaders can maintain their eye on the horizon and at the same time a grip on current events. I see some leaders who, by the time they've maintained grip on current events, have no capacity left to look at the horizon, and others who are so fixated on the horizon that what's happening today has run away from them, even though they're accountable for it. And there's an element of there which is about education and training, and an element of there which is about experience and intuition.
Again, a great point. And I think when I was doing crisis work at Deloitte, for example, we were trying to improve the crisis management capabilities of a lot of organizations. Some of the time, exactly to your point, they're too focused externally and not enough focused internally, or vice versa. And losing sight of that, and actually in the moment when stuff's going wrong, having the wrong focus or just expecting it to be the same was often something that derailed them almost completely. It was interesting to observe, and hopefully something we were able to turn around and put some stuff into fix.
Yeah.
When you go right back to the very beginning now, with all of your experience, and then just before we move into the next section of this, if you were talking to a school-age Richard Barrons, who spent too much time focused on the cadets as well, what would you be advising him to do with hindsight in terms of the way your career has developed and the things you've learned?
Well, it's a very difficult question to answer, because it's difficult to deal in the counterfactual. But I think in terms of things I've learned, the first is you can't predict the future, and there are no guarantees. I think when I was a teenager, there was a sense of an inevitable progression through a comfortable and interesting life. That was sort of how it felt at that time. And actually, I now know that life is an incredibly fragile thing where you can't change the past, so don't get stuck in it. And the future genuinely is unknowable because it's hostage to how so many things turn out. So you have to seize the moment. And I think I would also say, don't live life as a destination addict. I was probably guilty, perhaps in the first third of my military career, where I was doing things that were difficult from a personal point of view. You're a long time away, or a long time in a place you don't much care for, or you're doing things which didn't seem to me as interesting as being the lawyer I could have been, or the whatever. And that's a function of a junior officer's career. But if you lead your life being miserable on the grounds that it'll win a prize in the future, that's okay for a while, but you can't make a habit of it, because otherwise, you end up just old and embittered, because the future never arrived in the way that you thought. And I also think it's clear that fulfillment comes in many forms. So, as a former public servant, you never expect to be rich, and many of my peers, are living in the sorts of houses that you only see in Country Life magazine, and that's never going to come my way. So, on the other hand, in terms of the career I have had and I am having, there are many forms of fulfillment, and when it comes down to it, it's all about people and friends and family, and quite simple things matter more than perhaps some of the glamorous, bigger ambitions that you hold in a passage through life. When we remember we're just these tiny temporary specks in a giant universe that will forget about us, if it ever thought of us at all, in the instant that we leave this life. And in terms of mistakes, well, the flared trousers were a disaster in the 1970s, and I regret that very much, but I can't do anything about it.
Yeah, that's a great answer. Love it. On mistakes, so I talk about highs and lows a lot on these interviews, and we're kind of moving into that section. And I'm really looking forward to the fact that you've got a new book coming out, which, given the title is The Life and Times of General Sir Richard Barrons, I'm sure is going to cover a few highs and lows and bits, and no doubt be a very amusing read, knowing you as I do. But looking back across your career, what would you, if you had a magic wand and could do stuff differently, what would you do differently?
Again, hindsight is a terrible thing, and when you look back, you can't do anything about the things that you did. So what might So I think there were a couple of events early on in my career where I was responsible for training, and in some cases there were training accidents, and I wish they hadn't happened. And some of that was because of my inexperience or being undertrained in what I was doing. And I will always regret, that people got hurt, and they should never get hurt in training. That people get hurt on operations, but in training, you're not really meant to be doing that kind of thing. I think in terms of the major commitment to operations in Iraq and Afghanistan, which history is never going to be kind about, I think with hindsight, it is possible to be wiser about the nature of those operations and why they were always going to fall short. Now, some of that I will claim I and others said at the time, we cannot make this work for the following reasons. But what we were guilty of was then when we were told, well, we're in it now, you've got to keep going, we kept going. Maybe people will think that by looking at Iraq and Afghanistan as a series of one-year campaigns, which is generally the length of a particular senior leadership tour, we failed to get ever to the long-term challenges. But honestly, this is wisdom we only really had afterwards. And the thing that I regret most, and I'm still fighting the fight now, is that from about 2010 onwards, so when I was the Army Assistant Chief of General Staff onwards, I became clearer that we were losing the post-Cold War era, and we were going to have to deal with a resurgent and tricky Russia, and look at where we are today. But more than that, the digital age, so cloud, AI, robotics, autonomy, biosciences, all these other things, was going to change how you do defense and security as profoundly as it's changing how we live, work, and play. And I put a lot of effort, not least in my last job as Commander Joint Forces Command, into articulating what that was. And I made some ground in the argument for resources and changing the nature of investment. I didn't make as much ground as I aspired to or probably should have. And I'm still doing that today, where most armies, navies, and air forces are still spending their money on the latest evolution of the platforms, ships, tanks, and aircraft that they've been evolving now, for more than 100 years in some cases. When their own analysis is telling them that that's on a path to obsolescence, and the digital age in combination is going to reshape not just how they equip, but how they organize and how they operate. And this is a competition. It's a competition that will decide the outcome of great power confrontation. And I am as frustrated today as I was when I stepped out of my last job in uniform, that I couldn't get the UK further on the front foot of this, to set the example in the world, to restore our military effectiveness at a sustainable and affordable price. And I fear that because of that failure to wake people up to the nature of the world we live in and the changes that we have to make, that we're setting ourselves up to be one of the victims of the 21st century. And I wish I could do better than I've done so far.
Yeah, fascinating answer. I again, just to drill into one bit of that, because I think it's a really interesting area of debate. When you look beyond the military at kind of wider government responsibility and this whole digital vulnerability thing, we've obviously now, particularly with cyber, we've got a National Cybersecurity Centre. GCHQ is doing a lot more in this space, being a lot more open about the sort of things we do. We're more focused on infrastructure protection and so on. But do you think we're doing enough in that domain? Because my contention would be, not least when I look back at the time I was doing this kind of stuff in one of the jobs I had in the MOD as the head of targeting and information operations, which also looked after cyber, is that we still governmentally, we just don't really get this. We sell off infrastructure because we think it's a good thing to do. We don't look at supply chain security in anything like as robust a way as we should do to ensure that we're not leaving ourselves vulnerable in the very long term. I mean, the 30, 40, 50 year time frame, never mind the 5-year time frame. What's your thought?
So I think it's a much wider problem than the one that we think we've wrestled with. The first thing is our own analysts in government and in the commercial sector are telling us that we're living in this world which is dominated by sort of tenacious multipolarity as China rises, the center of power shifts to Asia, and the US, still powerful, maybe is in relative decline, but much less interested in investing its taxpayers' money certainly in European security. And great power confrontation between liberal democracy and autocratic capitalism is a feature of our time. But we've done great power confrontation before. But we've never done it before on a planet that we can't use in the way that we've used it for the last 300,000 years or so. So the competition is going to be much sharper. And we've never done great power confrontation through the effects of the digital age, which is changing how risk and indeed opportunity can be created. In other words, the digital age could mean that the things you've invested in that are meant to protect you are irrelevant. And an aspect of that is the way that artificial intelligence in particular is creating weapon systems which we don't fully understand how they work. Therefore, we may not be able to control them totally, but they will either be in charge of weapons like nuclear weapons that could destroy us all, or will build their own, and bioscience being one route to that. And so, although we might have a conversation about the protection of the undersea cables or the effectiveness of the cyber protection of our infrastructure, actually we're now confronting this much wider, deeper problem that we live in an age where we as mankind were still prepared to fight to the death for the concepts we hold in our heads, whether that's religion or nationalism, or it doesn't really matter. They don't exist in the physical world, but they exist in our heads. And we want to argue that these things, whatever they are eternal, universal, and in some cases exclusive. And now we're going to have that conversation and be prepared to fight to death with these new weapons that might destroy us, but we can't absolutely control. And we're going to be doing it on a planet which is beginning to reject us. This is the Anthropocene after all, and it's not going to live up to our demands, abuse, and expectations. And in the middle of all of that, those three things is us, Homo sapiens. And we have no track record as a species of taking collectively, and collectively means 8 billion people now, the sorts of hard decisions to change how we live and cooperate and tolerate each other that will master that world. So the conversation that we might have about marginally improving our cyber or physical defenses is, I think, about to be blown away by having to come to terms with, for today's leaders, with genuinely leading on the edge of potential extinction. And we've never had to confront that before.
Wow. Yeah, big answer. And I mean, it's obviously doubly challenged by the fact that almost invariably, certainly Democratic politicians' electoral horizon and therefore strategic focus is driven by election cycles. I don't think that, there's much strategic thinking that goes on in a lot of Democratic governments that's really long term. I think it tends to be focused, and decisions tend to be focused on too much the short term.
So, we get the politics we ask for in the end. And we've developed a politics which is about tiny changes at the margin, where our today's political leaders, and bless them because they volunteer for this, despite we pay them badly and then abuse them, through social media and other fora. But we get politicians who track what civil society thinks. And civil society thinks it would like more money for doing less. It's just, how we operate. And because our political leaders don't detect in civil society fear or anxiety or the sort of conversation we just had about potential extinction, they feel no need to think about it themselves because it involves hard decisions that would get them unelected. So in this odd situation where civil society is not inclined to raise these questions, at the ballot box, and our political leaders are not inclined to provoke them because they won't get elected. And to be honest, if that's the best we can do, we deserve to die out, because we aren't going to manage the sort of future that's coming our way. And so I would love to see the resurrection of political leadership at the level of genuine statesmanship that can say to people, this is a hard world, much harder than you wanted or we wanted. We're going to have to do these things, or our future and our children's future is negligible. I can't spot them. Yeah,
I totally agree. It's a great answer. Coming back to the highs and lows thing, what's on the high front? What do you consider your most important achievement to have been so far?
So I don't think I've achieved anything of great importance, other than I'm going to keep chipping away at this imperative for digital age transformation of defense and national security. So that's important. In terms of personally satisfying, they were the things that where I was given responsibility, and as far as I'm concerned, it seemed to go well, and they were really absorbing. So going into Bosnia at a week's notice as the brigade chief of staff, where, to be honest, we almost had to look at a map of where Bosnia was on the way down and then work it out as we went along. In a way, there was no manual, there was no script, and we were, for that period, the national news. That was, for a young major, really interesting. Same, I think, setting up the International Security Assistance Force in Afghanistan as the Taliban left in the winter of 2001 into 2002. So literally starting with what we carried off a plane that had to dodge around the holes in the runway the American Air Force had rather unhelpfully provided at Kabul. We built a thing in Kabul that the Afghan people at that time were genuinely appreciative of. And that was really hard work. We had no running water for 6 months in the place that we were camping in, and it was cold, and then it was really hot, and there were many, many challenges, but we made it work. That for me was a terrific thing. Commanding a regiment as a commanding officer, where you have 500 souls for whom you are entirely responsible for training them, for supporting them, for managing their careers, that's a buzz, and everybody would find that if you were, unless it somehow overwhelmed you, it's an enormous buzz. And the final thing is, as one of the 6 chiefs of staff responsible for the leadership of UK Armed Forces, for that very too brief period, you have your hand on part of the tiller that's determining how UK defence shapes, how you spend what is now £50 billion a year, how operations are conducted. That's really hard not to enjoy. You only get to do it for 3 years. But wow.
Yeah, that's a great answer. Thanks. Yeah, for every high, there's got to be a low. So what's the career low point for you?
So I come back to the issue of accountability. I mentioned before that there were training accidents on my watch as a relatively junior officer, which I regret. I think the bit that really stands out for me is when I was in my last job as Commander Joint Forces Command. Very early in my tenure, there was a selection course in Wales for the Special Forces, and a combination of events on that Saturday morning resulted in 3 volunteer soldiers dying. And this was largely attributed to the heat on the day, but a very complex situation involving people and judgment and technology and communications and the sheer will of these volunteers, frankly, to keep going. But the fact is, 3 really high caliber people who were volunteering for UK Special Forces died on the selection course. And in my last week as Commander Joint Forces Command, I took the Crown censure for that. So I think the last time I put my brown service dress on was to go and receive that censure as the Commander of Joint Forces Command. Now, I didn't even know the selection course was running. When it happened, I commanded 23,000 people. This was quite a long way down in my organization. It should never have happened, and I absolutely was accountable for it. And I regret that a part of my organization for which I was responsible was involved in that thing, and I couldn't bring the 3 people back.
No, it's another terrific answer. I mean, I remember that well because obviously I was working for you at the time as Director Joint Warfare, and the terrible accident. And as you said earlier on, we should train hard, but we shouldn't train so hard that we end up, seriously permanently damaging, or even killing the people that were training, for sure. So, and I think in the main, one of the things I think is great is, to put a more positive spin on some of that, is that certainly over my time in the Air Force, we have got much better at the safety aspect of what we do. I think I can remember, I grew up through a flying training system and through early days of operational flying where lots of people were killed in training accidents. It was a pretty regular thing. We would go, all too regularly to funerals and hear about friends, colleagues who'd lost their lives through the nature of what we were doing. We were flying very fast, flying very low. A lot of people hit the ground, various other things as well that went along the way. And every one of those was an absolute tragedy. We have got much better at learning from those. And I think the kind of open culture in terms of sharing knowledge and being much more appropriately transparent and reflective on how we can improve has made a real difference. But no, I can completely understand why that would be a significant low point for you.
So I think that this aspect of health and safety, which you've described in air and aviation, is absolutely right. And as someone who spent a long time frequently as a passenger in a military aircraft, I really did need the people in the front to know what they were doing, and if they felt it was wrong, to stop doing what they were doing. We all recall the rather spectacular helicopter arrivals at a forward operating base in Afghanistan, where essentially a 19-year-old needed to do a handbrake turn in a Chinook helicopter in order to get you down safely, and they pulled it off. On the other hand, today's military, and this may be more an army thing, I think has begun to lose the plot on health and safety, because the reluctance to take risk in training, to apply what is generally a misunderstood lexicon about health and safety, means that some completely mad restrictions have arrived, which means that people are not doing even basic training properly. So, for example, I'm as I mentioned, artillery officer, and to some degree, people are not allowed to fire their artillery gun at the maximum charge, the biggest amount of oomph that fires the shell down the barrel, because it's a bit loud and there's quite a lot of vibration. Well, to be honest, that's just transferring manageable risk in training to unmanageable risk in operations. And I think there's an aspect of military culture which, in a rather hierarchical and obedient way, has taken up what is essentially sound health and safety doctrine and has begun to misapply it, and is imposing completely daft rules on itself. And it just needs not to do that.
Yeah, I've seen a similar thing actually in various domains in my military time as well, and I share the view. I think it's difficult. It's a difficult balance, isn't it? Because there's so much litigation around as well now that is a factor. But you've got to be able to train fully for operations. Otherwise, don't try and do it in operations. If you're going to say, right, we're not going to have that operational capability anymore, that's one thing. But to then not be able to train for it and say the first time you're going to do it is when you're actually doing operations, because that's the risk we're going to take. That's that is a risk too far in my book as well. I share that. And
as you recall, I may have said to political leaders in the past, if your only objective in deploying a military force is to maintain its protection and not to take, therefore, any risks of casualties, leave it at home in bed, because it achieves its mission at much lower cost.
Yeah, 100%. Totally agree. On staying in bed, work-life balance. I'm just interested in your perspectives on how you manage it, and ways you personally de-stress, relax, and things you've kind of picked up along the way and that are useful to others.
So I think this is really important, and I don't think it's generally very well done. The first thing is, as a senior leader, it is absolutely clear that you cannot possibly do all the things people would like you to do, and you also have to recognize you can't execute the responsibilities of thousands of people who work for you. And one of the challenges that I've seen as people have developed through a career is they've been promoted into an appointment where they have to master delegation and empowerment. They have to rely on good enough people to do the stuff that has to be done. They can't check every document or take every decision, book every bus, check every meal. They have to rejoice in delegation and empowerment and make it work. Now, that means holding people to account for success or otherwise, but if you're going to command at a high level, you have got to do delegation and empowerment well. You've also got to be comfortable with ruthlessness. You're going to take hard decisions. That's your job, to make the hard calls. And if that means you can't sleep, you're in the wrong job. So I find compartmentalization is a really important part of leadership, where you have a tough day, you maybe have reverses, you maybe tell people their career is over or they've not done well, and then go home and forget about it, because that was your job. And then I think we need to recognize that as a senior leader, your job is not presenteeism, or to prove that you can answer more emails than anybody else in a given 24-hour period. Your job is to provide the vision and the inspiration, the creativity, the resilience and the adaptability. And that means managing your own well-being. So sleep enough, eat well, exercise, and commit time in the diary to being creative. Commander Joint Forces Command, much to the irritation, I think, of my staff, I would take about a day a month as thinking time, and I would go somewhere where they were not. So I'm a fellow at Queen's College, Oxford, and they were kind enough to lend me the wonderful old library where I would sit for a day with a notebook and a pen. I would review what was going on, how I thought I was doing, and what we needed to do differently. And this was an absolute menace for the staff, because I would come back and saying, this is what we're going to do now, and it would cause them work. But that's how things like the transformation of defense for the digital age came into some sort of form. I see too many leaders that are grey with fatigue because they've either over-traveled or they think that if they haven't responded to an email within 90 minutes, it's somehow an affront to their status. And they are trying to do the work of not just their direct reports, but their direct reports. This is madness. It suggests to me they're in the wrong job. And I think senior leaders need to be absolutely ruthless about what they focus on and how they do it, and not feel that they have to be a crowd pleaser the whole time.
It's again, so many good points in there, and with which I totally agree. What I try and do on these podcasts is I try and tap the kind of wider knowledge and experience of the guests that are kind enough to come on. And we've already talked about a fair amount of kind of world affairs and bits so far in what we've been discussing. But you speak very regularly on the media, as we touched on earlier, and looking at Ukraine, but also actually now at what's going on in Gaza. What's your kind of crystal ball for where this is heading? I mean, you already alluded to the kind of age of where we are in state on state and a sort of new order that's there. But on those conflicts in particular, what do you see the outcome being?
So I might just draw that back a little bit. So in looking at the business of Ukraine and Gaza, I think the first thing, certainly in the West, that we need to do is to accept that we are being reacquainted with war in the raw. And some people had tried to declare, as the Cold War ended in 1989, that we'd gone post-conflict, that war was something that we had civilized ourselves out of or only happened somewhere else in the world. And to some degree, that was affirmed by the sort of discretionary interventions that you and I conducted in places like Iraq and Afghanistan, which were away matches, which didn't really touch civil society or require much mobilization of effort. And what we're seeing in Ukraine and in the confrontation between Israel and Palestine is a very sharp reminder that war is this aspect of the human condition. It is brutal and feral and destructive and dangerous and irrational. And when the red mists descend, people will fight for poor reasons, vengeance, or whatever obsession they have in their head about ideology or the ism of their choice, and they'll do that to the detriment of their own long-term interests, and at a cost which includes destroying the built environment and lives and life prospects that have been established in some cases over centuries at the speed of high explosive. And this then creates a legacy of 20 years worth of rebuilding and 3 generations worth of distrust. So if we had persuaded ourselves that war was something that lesser people did, we should be very sharply reminded that war as a part of the human condition is alive and well, and it can choose you even if you didn't want it to. And that would be, I think, how many Ukrainians feel about what Russia is doing to them. And no doubt you would get the same from opinion in both Israel and Palestine in arguably different ways. And we need to think about that because if, as we've talked about, we're pre-conflict again, we're pre-conflict where war could happen to us. And in so many ways, we are just not prepared for this. And so then let's go back to your actual question is, well, how does this turn out? Well, in the context of great power confrontation, and I'm going to use this shorthand, a conversation between liberal democracy, the US and Europe largely, and others in one camp, and the autocratic capitalists in the other camp, China, but with Russia. This is a difficult conversation about how the world is going to work and who is preeminent. And in that context, if you look at Ukraine and what's going on in Gaza and what may happen in Taiwan, maybe we are drifting into a world where there might be lots of different conflicts, but they're somehow all connected because both camps are taking sides in them. And that would mean that the outcome in Ukraine, and indeed to some degree the outcome in Gaza, though I think less so, but definitely the outcome in Ukraine, is as much a matter to how we feel about our security and our prospects and values as it is for the people who are doing actually the fighting, in which case we need to be very closely aligned with the outcome and play our part in resourcing the right one. And in the case of Ukraine, we are blessed in that the fighting is being done by Ukrainians, and all we're being asked to do is make, frankly, a quite modest contribution to help them get the outcome that's in our interests. And we're not doing a brilliant job of that. And then if we think that what's happening in Ukraine is part of great power confrontation and to which our security is attached, then we need to have this profound conversation about how do we make ourselves resilient again as a society, because big wars are fought, won, and lost by civil society, not by people like you and me. And what do we need to do to restore the effectiveness of our defense forces, in particular, with our allies in NATO, to deter? Because my goodness, if you look at Ukraine or indeed Gaza, the deterrence is a much better thing to get right than for deterrence to fail, as it did in Ukraine, and then end up with all the costs and misery of having to fight a war. This is really a profoundly difficult pre-conflict period for us.
When you look at that, because again, really interesting answer, particularly on focusing on the Ukraine-Russia piece for a second. When you look at what's happened as a result of Israel and Gaza, and I think we could deal with that one as a totally separate discussion. The thing that I've noticed, though, is I was away on holiday actually when the horrible Hamas attacks happened, which are completely, nobody could possibly argue is anything other than forgivable. And Israel's response clearly has been very loud and expected subsequently, but it's also completely dominated the news media, not least in this country. And I just wonder whether or not we have this tendency at the minute to take our eye off the ball, and Ukraine has fallen almost completely out of the news as a result. And whether it's fallen completely out of government thinking is another matter, of course. I'm not suggesting it has necessarily, but certainly in terms of public sympathy and public support here, probably more importantly across the Atlantic in the US as they rapidly approach an election cycle themselves. Do you think we're at risk of not actually focusing on the outcome that we really need, and not being, just because it's kind of not there and dominating in the news media in the way that it was, we're going to drop that ball?
So I'm going to come back to one of the challenges of us as a species, Homo sapiens, is that we're not very good at concurrency, and we seem to be inherently short-termist. So we like our crisis one at a time, and we like them to be short, and we like them to be cheap, and we like them to happen to other people. And this just isn't going to work in the world that we live in. So we are going to have to manage concurrently difficult events. But I also think we require, and I think this is where I look at politicians, that we require our politicians to set out for us that we really are in this difficult world. We didn't choose it. It's not as nice as the world that we once inhabited, but we don't really get a choice now. We have got to confront this, and then to explain what confronting it means, why it matters to us, and what it's going to cost. And if those costs are not met and we don't rise to the challenge, then these are the outcomes or the risks that we may run. And I think the predisposition, certainly in Europe, and I think perhaps in much of the US, is to think about these crises in the abstract, that they are something that we might indulge or not, but they only affect people somewhere else in the world. This is not the world that we live in. It would be much better if we were capable of articulating the sorts of things I've described, and then taking the right preventive, painful medicine to ward off these effects. But there isn't much proven habit of doing that, not least when, for both civil society today and our political leaders, there's no adult experience of this sort of harm. And it would be much better to restore our defenses and our national resilience so that a bad thing didn't happen than wait for a bad thing to happen because our enemies take advantage of us and our friends are less inclined to protect us at their own expense, and then try and resurrect ourselves from what might literally be the ashes. And some of this is quite straightforward. So in the case of a confrontation with Russia, well, a Russian cruise missile takes about 90 minutes to get from the aircraft that releases it over Russia to the door, and it would literally be the door of 10 or 11 Downing Street. It can be that accurate. And if that technology exists, you would want to know that we could shoot that missile down in the way that Kyiv does successfully night after night now. But the fact is, right now, unless one particular ship is in the right place and working, and the missile obliges coming one at a time, not as 80 or 90, which is what you see, we couldn't. So I really struggle with this dissonance between the picture that people are painting and the actions that we're taking to ward off the effects of that picture.
Yeah, it's a pretty stark portrayal, but I completely agree. I think the general public perception of capability we have versus the actual capability we have are two completely different things. And that's not a great place for us to be, for sure. And it's a very difficult political argument. I mean, interestingly, sticking on the sort of geopolitical thing for a second, when I interviewed David Petraeus, we talked a bit about the US and the US role in the world and where they were heading politically. And his very, very clear view, which I completely subscribe to, is that the US is likely to remain the most important player in terms of being in the front rank of any international response to a whole range of different crises around the globe. However, when you look at the kind of current US political climate, and particularly at least the prospect of a sort of Donald Trump 2.0 and returning him to the White House with a clearly defined position around make America great again, more isolationism, less global policemen, pull out of NATO potentially, all those sorts of things that are there. That's a narrative that's obviously pretty threatened. I'd just be interested, before we move to the last couple of questions, just what your view is on that kind of wider US dynamic.
So next year is the 75th birthday of NATO. And NATO, since its inception, has relied on the US as the military superpower and the largesse of the American taxpayer, who is paying $850 billion. I'm going to say that again, $850 billion a year for the American armed forces, of which a significant proportion is dedicated to the security of NATO, really of Europe. And a couple of things are changing. The first is the US priority is managing its conversation with China. So it's going to look left, not right. Secondly, the US national debt is enormous, even by US standards, and that's not sustainable. And defense expenditure is a part of that. And many American taxpayers are saying, as they look at Europe, say, well, you have healthcare and education and decent roads and strong public sector. And you've got those things because you've spent your money on that, because we've spent our money on your defense. And we're less inclined to do that, A, because we've borrowed too much money, and B, because we're looking at China as our priority, and C, because why should we? and this is the Trumpian and some of the Republican Party position. And yet, if you look at Europe, an economy of 15 trillion euros a year, 500 million people, Europe does not align military or political power with its economic strength. And that's a feature of the post-Cold War era. We didn't want to have to do that, and we didn't have to, mostly because America was paying for our defense. So it's just possible we are approaching this sea change in how Europe, of which geographically the UK will always be part, has to attend to its security and stand up for its own interests. And in the context of an election for Mr. Trump leading in the polls, people worry about Mr. Trump as an individual, but we should reflect on the fact that if he is elected as president, it's because tens of millions of Americans have supported his platform. So this isn't just a discussion with Mr. Trump. This is a discussion with tens of millions of Americans about how they want to relate to us. And whilst I absolutely concur that we should do everything we can to bind America into NATO and the defense of Europe, because we will be stronger for it, and the bill of replacing them would be, it's beyond imagination, frankly, in military terms. We may just have to accept that at the very least, Europe is going to have to hold up its end of the log rather better and stand up for its own interests out of its own interests, and not rely and think and assume that the US is our natural protector. That 75 years may be about to close.
Terrific, if rather sobering answer. And takes me to the two final questions, because you've been very generous with your time and I don't want to abuse that. I always ask people, though, first question, what's the most memorable event of your career?
I honestly, I cannot select just one, because the beauty of a military career, which tends to come in 3-year snapshots, is in the context of any 3-year tour, there's usually something. But there are three, therefore I'm going to have three spring to mind. And I've mentioned them before. The first is, as a major, suddenly no longer running an armor brigade in Germany and the rump of the end of the Cold War. And at a week's notice, I'm in Bosnia as the chief of staff of this thing that we're making up as we go along, with the world's media watching. Secondly, I'd have to say commanding 3rd Regiment Royal Horse Artillery, because at that level of command, you have total responsibility at a level where you know everybody. And in the British system, that's a unique level of responsibility. It's not every day was a joy, of course, but the whole thing is a buzz. And then I would say the third thing probably would be almost reprising the Bosnia experience in being rung up on a Monday night on my last day in command of 3RHA by General John McCall to be told, that thing we talked about in Afghanistan that I said would never happen, but if it did, you were coming. Well, it's Friday. And then, having to get there and unfold it over the next 8 months. I mean, in one military career, those were all really absorbing things.
Yeah, I can imagine. I've got a similarly complicated answer, I think, if I was to answer the same question myself. Very last question there, Richard. What's the most difficult question you've ever been asked?
So, these would be about major disappointments where you're responsible for something, you think it's going well, and then you find that somewhere in the organization for which you have some responsibility, the wrong thing has happened. And the one that sticks out in my mind most is when I was the chief of staff of the multinational division in Iraq. So we took over from the 1st Armored Division that had fought the war into Iraq, and we were setting up this division that was responsible for the southern half of Iraq, but specifically in Basra, where we had all sorts of appropriate, noble ambition to make the world or that part of the world better. And we were struggling because, we could do the military thing, but we didn't have the money to fix the electricity system quickly. but we arrived thinking that we were going to liberate the Iraqi people from the yoke of Saddam Hussein. And actually, we'd done that, and many people were appreciative. And then on this day, it was brought to my attention by the military police that some British soldiers had essentially murdered prisoners in our detention, essentially by kicking them to death. And they did that. And they were part of the same army I was, and I was the divisional chief of staff. And therefore, I had some accountability for this. And you just don't want that thing to have happened. But it having happened, you can't deny it. You have to deal with it, and you have to admit it. And those were difficult days.
Yeah, I can imagine that. Wow. That's another sobering end to what's been a fascinating interview. It's always a great privilege to talk to you, and a great pleasure to talk to you. And today's been no exception. I am extremely grateful, Richard. Thank you very much indeed.
That's been a pleasure.